Righty-ho, so part 2 of our character study on Napoleon. Let's get to it. Now, if we begin at the start of chapter 6, I think it's important that you think about structure here because, as we said in the last PowerPoint, chapter 5 was very clearly the chapter that showed how Napoleon had planned, how he had used strategic planning in order to bring about his dictatorship. And as soon as that dictatorship is brought about in chapter 5, the next chapter opens with this simile. Now, Orwell, as you know, is a journalist, and because of his journalist training, his writing style is one that does not favour figurative language, and yet he opens chapter 6 with this simile: all that year the animals worked like slaves. And I think it's important that we recognise that once the regime, the fascist regime of Napoleon has been established in chapter 6, then the opening of chapter 7 reinforces the new status of the animals, that they are slaves. And there's irony in this in the simile, because they, of course, they are. So it's not like that. It's not as if they just work like slaves. They are indeed slaves. And it's a significant moment in the text. It's a moment where the reader is aware of how far the reality of Animal Farm has moved away from the ideal. The animals are slaves. They receive their orders, they are controlled psychologically, and they are controlled physically through the brutality of the regime, reinforced by the dogs. And the dramatic irony is here because we as a reader, we recognised all of that became apparent in chapter 5, but no one thought to tell the poor animals. They did not and do not recognise the state that they're in. Okay, again, just that idea of powers coming together, the physical power of Napoleon with the persuasive power of Squealer, and here you have it in this distortion of language. In the quotation, this work was strictly voluntary, but any animal who absented himself from it would have his rations reduced by half. And again, when you think about it, Napoleon has risen to such power because he understood the simple needs of the populace, the need to have some sort of emotional connection with an ideal, with a dream, and also primarily the idea of having their stomachs filled. And so in order to coerce the animals into doing what he wants them to do, what does he do? He goes to the stomach again to have the rations reduced by half. And of course here you have, through Squealer, the distortion of language, that idea that he plays with semantics. And dramatic irony again, another presentational method used by Orwell, comes into play here because the animals are being manipulated. Their inability to understand what the word voluntary means. And again, we as a reader, we've watched all this happen. We understand the game that's being played. Unfortunately, the poor animals do not. Food, again, linked to Napoleon and Napoleon's regime. If they had no more food than they had in Jones's day, at least they didn't have less. And again, we have the understanding of this rationale as exhibited by this evidence is not the thoughts of the animals themselves, but obviously something that has been suggested to them by Squealer. Under Jones, the animals were, according to Old Major, just given enough to survive. If you remember, he said that in chapter 1. However, the facts of chapter 1 did not really bear that out, because Old Major himself was fat. Clover, her stoutness, that she maintained that stoutness after her having her foals. Mr. Jones put milk in the mash of the animals. So food has always been used as a bargaining tool. It's always been used as a way of manipulating the minds of the animals, and here it's just being used again. And the quotation gives you this understanding of how language is being played with and how the animals fall for it every time. Napoleon's rise to power, the strategic thinking that he utilised in chapters 3 and in chapter 4 and chapter 5. Well, not chapter 4, remember, because chapter 4 is the Battle of Cowshed and he's not in it at all. So chapter 3 and chapter 5, that strategic thinking, once he has achieved his power, it's not as if that stops, because then he is moving in a new direction, and he has an ultimate aim, his super objective, not only to be in complete control, but to be in complete control with a sense of parity in relation to himself and the humans. And so what he wants to do here, he wants to engage in trade. You've got the sort of darkly comic use of semantics there. Engage in trade, not of course for any commercial purposes. Well, what is trade if it is not commercial? But it gives you this understanding of Napoleon. He has a long-term objective that he wants to achieve, and that is to be a human, to be as good as a human. The reader also picks up on the dramatic irony here, but the poor animals do not, and their stupidity is becoming tragic and a little frustrating, because remember, Orwell is not picking sides here. It's not as if he's giving you a presentation of Napoleon for you to hate completely and for you to sympathise completely with the poor animals. What he's trying to do is trying to critique a way of thinking, a critique a way of using political systems to exploit, and also to critique and to criticise those who make themselves so easy, or make themselves fall easy prey to such exploitation and such manipulation. The animals, you should be frustrated with them. You should be frustrated with their stupidity, with their apathy, particularly with characters like Benjamin. They are at fault. Yes, they are victims, but they are also complicit. They're also participating in this game, albeit unknowingly. But their apathy, their stupidity, their unwillingness to engage in any sort of critical thought is frustrating. It is something that they can be blamed for. Now, the use of the hens, the exploitation of the hens, if you look at the quotation, the hens said Napoleon should welcome this sacrifice as their own special contribution towards building the windmill. We talked about Napoleon and sacrifices earlier on, because what he does is he exploits the sacrifices that other animals make. And here he's wanting to do exactly the same with the hens. And when we talked previously about styles of leadership, here Napoleon's perhaps taking advantage of a leadership style more closely associated with Snowball. Because what does he do? He presents an idealistic view of things. He uses idealism to prevent the animals from focusing on the reality. You know, he uses emotive terms like sacrifice, and he offers glittering generalities like a special contribution, which makes it seem as if the hens are doing something wonderful, that's something that only they can do. He wants the hens to feel privileged, because what he's doing, he's redirecting attention away from the fact that he's exploiting them, just as Mr. Jones did. But you could even say that this exploitation is worse, because this is an exploitation that is not just taking away what is rightfully theirs, but he's exploiting them emotionally, he's exploiting them psychologically as well. And those two areas of exploitation were not open to Mr. Jones, but they are to Napoleon, and he stops at nothing to ensure that he gets his way. And then also in relation to the super objective to achieve a sense of parity with humans, you get this little matter-of-fact sentence. It was about this time that the pigs suddenly moved into the farmhouse. The short sentence in some ways belies the significance of this. It sounds quite understated, but really it's powerful, because if we remember in chapter 1, Old Major, one of his central tenets is that the animals were not to become like the humans in their battles against them. And yet here we get a glimpse of what it is that Napoleon really wants to be. He wants to be a human. And the animal farm animals, unfortunately, do not understand the totality of Napoleon and his desires. What you also have here too is a reference to that idea of history belongs to the victors, because the pigs can do whatever they wish. They can change the past. They can break whatever rules. They are assured of the fact that they can change the understanding of the animals, and therefore moving into the farmhouse is something that they can do. Without any sense of there being a consequence to that. So, having moved into the farmhouse, then we find that the we find how easily the pigs will dispense with what seem to be the sacred tenets of this ideology, of this system of thought. And you have it here with no animal shall sleep in a bed with sheets. And the technique they use is by adding these codicils to the commandments, these extra little clauses to the commandments. And in doing so, what they do is they prove that nothing is sacred, that even those commandments, which if you think about it, they're meant to be analogous with the idea of the Christian commandments, the 10 commandments that God gave to Moses. But here, they're not sacred. They're not words carved in stone as they were with the Christian commandments. What they are words that can be changed and have their meanings changed just by the addition of these little codicils. The tragedy is that the rules, which were meant to safeguard equality, they're now mere tools to be used in maintaining oppression. And the fact that the pigs add these things to the commandments, so clearly adding these things to the commandments, just shows how little they care for the opinions of the other animals, and how little they believe in the intellectual capabilities of the other animals, that they think, well, should we just add these on and tell them that they've been there the whole time, and they'll believe that. It's as if their power is omnipotent, that there is nothing that they will balk at, there is nothing that will stop them. Snowball's clever, but Napoleon is really clever, because Napoleon understands how to manipulate the mind, and he does this with the development of this ad hominem approach. Remember that an ad hominem approach is a particular persuasive technique where you deliberately criticize one person. You make a scapegoat. And so that's what we have here with Snowball. Snowball is made into a scapegoat. It shows that Napoleon can do this for his own purposes. He's willing to exploit anything for his own purposes. You've also got a little bit of humour here, because if you look at the quotation, Snowball has done this thing. Comrades, here now I pronounce a death sentence upon Snowball, animal hero second class. Now, we know that after the Battle of the Cowshed, Snowball was given animal hero first class, and the poor dead sheep was the one that got the second class honour. But here, so arrogant, so egotistical is Napoleon that he can't even bear to say it. He can't even bear to say that Snowball was animal hero first class. And so he devalues his honour by reducing it to the second class. And for the reader, it's a moment of dark comedy, because we can laugh just at how extreme Napoleon's egotism is. Really can't even bear to give Snowball his true title, even though he's defaming him. He needs to reduce the honour in order to do that. So completely and utterly wrapped up in his own little mind and his own ego that he takes this step. Again, what are we doing here with Napoleon? We're linking him to food, linking him to the idea of the lowest common denominator, the lowest, the most instinctive thing that the animals need. What do animals need? They need food, they need shelter. And here Napoleon exploits that. You've got another verb choice, ordered. Napoleon ordered the almost empty bins in the store shed to be filled nearly to the brim with sand, which was then covered up with what remained of the grain and meal. On the suitable pretext, Wiper was led through the store shed and allowed to catch a glimpse of the bins. So the idea that the truth of the situation, the poor harvest, the situation that the animals find themselves in, that has to be hidden from the humans. And the verb choice ordered shows again the strategic thinking of Napoleon. His success and importance comes before all things, even the starvation of the animals. And again, we find ourselves finding this darkly comic, but it really isn't when you consider that allegorically It's meant to represent the famine that happened in Russia in the 1930s, where millions and millions of Russian people died. But of course, that had to be hidden. That had to be hidden from the Western world, because Stalin and his communist ideology had to appear to be successful. So here you have Napoleon, and you have his ideology, his power. All of that has to be preserved, and therefore we have the ordering of the empty bins to be filled, because it makes it quite apparent that lives are expendable here. It's the ego of the powerful one that is important. Lives are expendable. Now, in relation to developing a cult of personality here, what you have is the understanding that Napoleon and his egotism is put on a pinnacle in some respects. If you look at the quotation, in these days Napoleon rarely appeared in public, but spent his time in the farmhouse, which was guarded at each door by the fierce-looking dogs. When he did emerge, it was in a ceremonial manner, with an escort of 6 dogs who closely surrounded him and growled if anyone came too near. So by developing this cult of personality, by distancing himself from his followers, it makes him seem more elusive, mysterious. It creates this belief that he's almost like a demigod, that he is something to be worshipped from afar. And by allowing his audience only to glimpse him occasionally, then they believe they're experiencing something that is momentous and something that is wonderful. It's all there to create a more theatrical version of his power. But in many ways it's paradoxical, because the idea that whenever he emerges it has to be in a ceremonial manner surrounded by the dogs suggests some level of paranoia, suggests some level of vulnerability. The dogs always have to be there with him. If his power was omnipotent, would they need to be there? That's something that you might want to argue. But the point is that Napoleon is a showman, that he has decided that by distancing himself from his followers, he will make himself appear to be almost godlike. Now, it's at this point of distance, it's at this point where he's developing the cult of personality, that we start to see perhaps little fractures appearing within the power base of Napoleon. And this particular issue with the hens makes that very apparent. So you have with the hens, when the hens heard this, they raised a terrible outcry. They protested that to take the eggs away now was murder. And you've got this building in terms of emotional intensity. The emotive language used here will become more and more powerful. The fact that the birds do no longer blindly accept, they choose to question what it is that Napoleon's saying, in that they have to produce more eggs and that more eggs have to be taken away. That questioning is something that cannot be allowed in a regime like Napoleon's. Napoleon's regime is a totalitarian one. It needs blind obedience, and the fact that the hens choose not to be obedient, they choose to destroy their eggs rather than give them to Napoleon, it's a crucial act of defiance, but importantly, it's an act of individual free will. It's an act of autonomy. And by doing that, there is where you see the little fissures beginning to be clear in Napoleon's power base. Because by claiming individual free will, by no longer being a puppet to the puppet master Napoleon, his authority is being challenged. He must react severely if he's going to stand up to this challenge. And so what he has to do is destroy it completely, which is what he does. So if you look at the adverbs, then Napoleon acted swiftly and ruthlessly. The adverbs are important because, as we said in the preceding slide there, that he has to act quickly, and that's what he does. He ordered the hens' rations to be stopped. Again, Napoleon linked to the accessibility of food, and decreed that any animal giving so much as a grain of corn to the hens should be punished by death. Starving the animals and getting the other animals to be complicit in it, that if they tried to help the hens, that then they would be signing their own death warrant. So what he tries to do here is that he makes it very clear that nothing but complete obedience will be accepted here. He has to establish that through complete and utter fear, and that's what he does. So dissent and defiance, they cannot be tolerated, and so what will have to take their place will be complete and utter fear. So whereas we had previously in chapter 5, you had the idea that opposition was drowned out by the bleating of the sheep and by the growling of the dogs. Here opposition is starved out of the animals, and the fact that they see the hen starving and that they are completely powerless to do anything to act creates this climate of complete and utter fear. That fear then is developed further by the psychological fear, the fear of the unseen menace of Snowball. And if you look here, it said, it seemed as though Snowball were some kind of invisible influence pervading air around them and menacing them with all kinds of danger. So by using the dramatic irony here and by using the metaphor of an invisible influence and menacing them, what happens is that the animal's fear is misdirected. They have a real opportunity here to be fearful because of the terrible actions that Napoleon has put in place in relation to the hens. But rather than get them to focus on that, what Napoleon does is by creating this ad hominem approach to Snowball, he misdirects their fear. They start to blame Snowball for creating the climate of terror, when in fact it's actually Napoleon and his regime that is menacing them with all kinds of dangers. But of course this opportunity to misdirect, this opportunity to confuse, this opportunity to control, these are things that we expect Napoleon to do, and that he does so very well, because he's been doing them since chapter 3. Hand in hand with Squealer then, there's that opportunity to see how Napoleon and Squealer can rewrite history. Our leader, Comrade Napoleon, announced Squealer, speaking very slowly and firmly, has stated categorically, Comrade, Snowball was Jones's agent from the very beginning, yes, and for long before the rebellion was ever thought of. So again, the opportunity to traduce or to completely ruin the reputation of Snowball is something that they will take and that they will use, because what they're doing is combining the common enemies of the past and present. The common enemy of the past was Jones, the common enemy of the present is Snowball, despite the fact that for us, the reader, the glaring common enemy is Napoleon. But by combining these two things together, he creates a climate where the animals believes that they can trust nothing and no one but Napoleon. The question is, when he has to be so exaggerated in his criticism of Snowball, is that something that shows Napoleon's strength, or does it show his weakness? The fact that he has to use Snowball to misdirect the fear, to create some sort of way to blame the terror that the animals are feeling, or to blame this climate of fear, this climate of terror on, the fact that he has to do that with Snowball, surely that suggests a level of weakness, that he knows that his control is slipping, and so he has to take these particular actions in order to try and re-establish it and reaffirm it. Now, Boxer, he does not, just like the hens, he does not choose to blindly accept things at this point, because he questions what he's told. Even Boxer, who seldom asked questions, was puzzled. He lay down, tucked his forehoofs beneath him, shut his eyes, and with a hard effort managed to formulate his thoughts. I do not believe it. Now you have this humorous depiction of Boxer in deep thought, and what it does is it contrasts with the repercussions of what he says. I do not believe it. It's a short sentence, a declamatory sentence, and yet that sentence is what ultimately signs his death warrant. The fact that he does not absorb the teachings of Napoleon, that he does not immediately say Napoleon is always right. that for Boxer really marks him out. To think for himself signs his own death warrant because Napoleon expects obedience. He does not want individuals thinking. And when you think about this particular description of Boxer, he appears so determined to use that little brain of his for a purpose. And even when he does that, how tragic it is that it's that particular purpose that means that death has to follow soon. Okay, what we have here is a sense of strength and weakness being juxtaposed. Boxer was still a little uneasy. I do not believe that Snowball was a traitor at the beginning. That's different, said Boxer. If Comrade Napoleon says it right, it must be true. And here Boxer illustrates thinking for himself. It gives us this opportunity to see some strength within him as a character, because he can try and discern what is true from what is just the propaganda that is being spread by Squealer. But the weakness within him lies in the fact that he can't take the next step, the step beyond it, which is to doubt Napoleon, to see Napoleon as fallible, as someone who can be wrong. But he cannot do that. He simply accepts with that motif that he uses again and again and again, that maxim that he uses, if Comrade Napoleon says it, it must be right. He allows himself to put more trust in Napoleon than he can actually do in his own thinking, his own feeling, in his own memory. He trusts Napoleon more than he trusts himself. And that must be very clearly seen as a sign of Napoleon's strength, that he can do that he can make animals trust in him more than they trust in themselves. Righty-ho, so we get to the opportunity to see what's going to happen to poor Boxer with the show trials and the dogs, controlled of course by Napoleon. So if we look at the verb choice, the animals, they all cowered silently in their places, seeming to know in advance that something terrible was about to happen. And we get a clear sense that the animals they're controlled by fear in a way that they never were under Mr. Jones. And if you think about it, if Napoleon's agenda, if his ultimate objective is to be like humans, in this case he's actually he's achieved that and surpassed it, because they fear him. They fear this climate more than they ever did life under Mr. Jones. Let's look at what happens to Boxer then. So Boxer saw them, the dogs. Boxer saw them coming and put out his great hoof, caught a dog in midair and pinned him to the ground. The dog shrieked for mercy and the other two fled with their tails between their legs. Boxer looked at Napoleon to know whether he should crush the dog to death or let it go. Napoleon appeared to change countenance and sharply ordered Boxer to let the dog go. We talked before just about this juxtapositioning between strength and weakness, how strength and weakness in relation to Boxer are juxtaposed, and here you have them again, because the physical power of Boxer is juxtaposed with his mental weakness. He could crush those dogs, and in doing so he could crush Napoleon, and yet, even when he's in a position to pin the dog to the ground, he looks to Napoleon for instruction. He looks to that paradoxical little phrase there, our leader, Comrade Napoleon. He looks to him for all the answers rather than trusting his own judgment. And again, that is something that, as much as we care for Boxer and as much as we see him as heroic, we are frustrated with his inability to trust his own judgment, to act as an individual, to act autonomously. So after the show trials, if you just notice how language is used differently here, the journalistic quality of Orwell's writing has changed completely. He writes, when they had finished their confession, the dogs promptly tore their throats out until there was a pile of corpses lying before Napoleon's feet, and the air was heavy with the smell of blood, which had been unknown since the expulsion of Jones. You've got that graphic language. the air heavy with the smell of blood. It's a violent purging of Napoleon's traitors. And the journalistic style is abandoned, and instead we get this language graphic in its ability to communicate in a very vivid sense how horrid this particular scene is for the animals. The reader is shocked. The animals themselves are shocked. There's this move towards a more sensory description that we've not had from Orwell before. And that change in tone, that change in style, perhaps is needed to allow us to empathise with the animals. We've been frustrated with the animals and their apathy, but here we cannot spend time thinking about how they're culpable or how they're can be blamed for the situation. Here the only thing we can do is empathise with them, because they are so shocked at witnessing this genocide, and we're shocked too, and that shock is made apparent through a change in language style here, through this adoption of a more graphic writing style focused on really abhorrent sensory description that we have not had before, because we've never had this level of violence before. Again, to evoke this empathic reaction from the reader, to create a sense of pathos, to create the sadness of this scene, you've got a return to the particular motif that we've seen all the way through. With one accord, they all lay down as though huddled together for warmth. Clover, Muriel, Benjamin, the cows, the sheep, and a whole flock of geese and hens, everyone. Now, that phrase, with one accord, has been used to signpost moments in the rebellion's life. They acted with one accord to begin the rebellion. They galloped with one accord around the fields when the rebellion had taken place. And now here you have the idea that it's been used when the last hope for animalism has gone. The animals are seen vulnerable and broken. You've got that verb choice that they're huddling together. And the reader can remember the hope and the optimism that they had in chapter 2 and in chapter 3, and how that seems like a lifetime away, because what they're left with now is just the warmth of their own bodies for comfort. There's nothing else to hold on to. And as if to take away the last foundation stone of animalism, Beasts of England is now banned, because the completion of the rebellion has taken place, and therefore Beasts of England is no longer needed. And Squealer says, "It is no longer needed, comrades," said Squealer stiffly. "Beasts of England was the song of rebellion, but the rebellion is now completed." And the completion of the rebellion sounds quite a hollow achievement when you think about the ideals that they had, what they believed that they were going to achieve, the hope and the comfort they took in believing that had been achieved in chapter 2, and now what are they left with? Nothing but the emptiness of having that ideal taken away from them in such a bloody and horrific way. The hope and comfort which Beasts of England created was never needed more than at this moment in time, but just when they need it, then they can no longer have it. There's no hope, there's no comfort. These positive things that they maintained, that they held on to, they're lost forever. And what are they surrounded by now? Piles of corpses. And it's at this point that we realise that whatever the rebellion was, it was not for this moment in time that the animals had acted. They never thought that they would get to this particular point, and yet they have. And we cannot do anything other than feel pathos at this moment for the animals and the loss of their dream.